TIAA is on a mission. Why? Because 54% of Black Americans don't have enough savings to retire. So in collaboration with big-name artists like Wyclef Jean, TIAA released Paper Right, new music inspiring a new financial future. With 100% of streaming sales going to a nonprofit that teaches students how to invest. Stream Paper Right now and help close the gap.
What is up, everyone? Welcome to this edition of There Can Only Be One, the podcast that puts together the all-star best of playlists of your favorite bands and artists. Now, I have said on previous episodes that I have musical blind spots, and there are albums from artists that we have covered that I did not know existed. Today's artist, I knew they existed, but I had never heard a single song from them until researching for this episode. This episode, we are talking Black Rebel Motorcycle Club, and here to join me for this journey, Marc Shea from the Performance Anxiety Podcast, also on the Pantheon Podcast Network. Marc, welcome to the show for the first time. How are you doing?
I'm wonderful, man. Thank you so much for having me on, and I've been enjoying the past episodes. And I gotta say, you got the best radio voice or podcast / radio voice. I love it, man. I love listening to your show.
Little did you know that when the microphone's not on, I just sound like I'm on helium. So really, it's all smoke and mirrors here. It's all smoke and mirrors.
That is how I love to roll. So let's do it. I'm set.
Okay, so as we were preparing for the show, and you mentioned doing Black Rebel Motorcycle Club, and I said, really, I've never heard a single song. Were you completely shocked?
I was. I honestly was. I have a very tight circle of musical friends, and I have forced, if they don't love Black Rebel Motorcycle Club, I have forced them on them because they're my favorite active band. So they're my favorites of all time. Are kind of, they get a little weird, but it's like, you know, obviously like Led Zeppelin, but there's the Verve and Black Rebel Motorcycle Club are like my top three. So the first two no longer are active, and so BRMC is top active.
Oh, I remember the Verve. I remember getting if I remember correctly, it was the Triple Scoop compilation cassette, and it had On Your Own by the Verve on that cassette. I said cassette, so that tells you exactly how old I am. But I remember that song being really, really good and so much better than Bittersweet Symphony.
Oh, gosh. Yeah. Urban Hymns is my least favorite of their albums. My favorite is first or second, Storm in Heaven or Northern Soul. Those are just brilliant albums. Unfortunately, they don't. Well, they do have an album of B-sides. If that counts, you could do one on the Verve, because that would be 5 albums total.
Ooh, I'd be down for that. I'd be down for that. We'll have to book that one once we're done here. But before we do that, let's get into what we are talking about here. We are talking about Black Rebel Motorcycle Club and about to go through 10 albums in their studio discography. And as always, we are not doing any live albums. But we're going to start with BRMC, released April 3rd, 2001. The band at this point is Peter Hayes, Robert Levon Bean, and Nick Jago. And again, I apologize if I mispronounce anyone's name. I am a Canadian idiot in a basement with a microphone. The album peaked at number...
idiot upstairs with a microphone.
See, we have it covered, both sides of the border. We're good.
Exactly.
The album peaked at number 25 in the UK and is gold in the UK. There were 5 singles off of this one. Spread Your Love charted the highest on the UK charts at number 27. However, Whatever Happened to My Rock and Roll Punk Song hit number 7 on the UK indie charts. Now, for me, again, this is brand spanking new, first time ever hearing Black Rebel Motorcycle Club, and this is my first taste of them. I personally went with Rifles off of this one because it's the bass line during the verses to the sweeping chorus. I mean, it's a really, really good mellow groove for me, but off of this first album, what did you go with?
I picked Awake off of the album because it's got this very, I don't want to say psychedelic, but maybe floating verse, but once it hits that bridge and gets to the chorus, there's this buzzsaw guitar that comes in, and that is completely... That's basically what the sound of Black Rebel Motorcycle is at this time. It's definitely my favorite song off the album, and I almost went with Punk Song because that was probably their most popular track. They used it in a lot of commercials and things like that. That and Spread Your Love were both used in commercially quite a bit, at least here in the U.S.
That's the thing, and maybe it's because I'm Canadian and I just haven't been, really introduced or in the right arena to be able to hear them. But, as I'm listening to this and just getting a vibe for everything, you're right on the buzzsaw guitar sound and all that. And, in answer to the question, how much reverb would you like on the vocals? Clearly the answer is yes.
Yeah.
But I can see how this fits a very, not necessarily a chill vibe, but definitely a sit back and have a good sip kind of vibe.
Oh, for sure. And to put them into a little bit of perspective, before forming Black Rebel Motorcycle Club, Peter Hayes kind of escaped Brian Jonestown Massacre. So if you ever watch the movie Dig, he's actually in it, and you see him leaving Brian Jonestown Massacre. He actually, in the middle of recording, he left. He got in a car and drove away. So that's where maybe some of that influence has rubbed off on some really early BRMC stuff.
We now move on to August 25th, 2003, and the release of Take Them On Your Own. The album peaked at number 3 in the UK and did hit the top 10 in Italy as well as hitting number 47 in the US. The album is gold in the UK. There were 3 singles off of this one. Stop hit number 19 on the UK charts. So off of Take Them On Your Own, what did you go with?
I picked In Like the Rose, and Take Them On Your Own is actually my least favorite album by theirs. It actually almost made me dismiss the band because it seems like they were kind of, I don't want to say instructed, but maybe encouraged to kind of distill and write an entire album of songs that kind of sounded like the hits off of BRMC. And those weren't my favorite songs on their debut album. So when they just kind of focused on that sound, they made an entire album of music that I was just kind of like, okay, it's not bad, but There's
always this theory of the sophomore slump.
Yes.
And because really you have your entire life to write your first album, and then you got to put out a second album as soon as you're off the road touring from the first album.
Yep.
Does it feel with this album like it suffered from that sophomore slump?
Completely. It feels like they were, they weren't confident enough in making their own decisions, maybe. And I've had Pete and Leah from Black Rebel Motorcycle Club on the podcast, and we talked a little bit about this, and they weren't completely, they didn't feel they were completely free to make their own, I don't want to say decisions, but they were being guided more than making the decisions. And it was evident because it's not as diverse as their previous album or any of the albums that came after it.
I will say, I also went with In Like the Rose. And I think the thing for me with this song is, and maybe you can tell me whether I'm way off base or not, because again, this was all entirely a brand spanking new first listen for me, the entire discography.
Yeah.
This album had some Joy Division vibes to it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And one thing to remember is that the bassist, so there's Peter and Robert are the bassist and the guitarist, and they kind of switch on and off depending on the song. Robert plays bass most of the time. Pete plays guitar most of the time. They switch off on vocals, but it's Robert's dad was in The Call, and so he was touring with bands like New Order and listening to Joy Division and things, because those were big influences on him, and it's definitely felt in this album.
Oh, absolutely. It's as I was going through this album, specifically this album, I was definitely hearing those Joy Division kind of vibes. And really made me kind of think about that Joy Division documentary that came out not that long ago, which is a phenomenal documentary. If you love Joy Division at all, please, by all means, go and watch that film. But now we move on to August 22nd, 2005, and the release of Howl. The album peaked at number 14 in the UK and number 90 in the US, and is silver in the UK. There were 3 singles off of this one. Ain't No Easy Way peaked at number 21 on the UK charts. So off of Howl, what did you go with?
This was so tough because this is the album that actually brought me back into the band. In talking with Peter, they said that the reaction to Take Them On Your Own was not anything like they thought it was going to be. It didn't sell as much. The record company wasn't as happy with it, even though, they kind of gave them what they wanted. And so they went into the studio with F it, this is what we're doing. We're going to make the album we want. I don't care what it sounds like. We're going to make it the way we want it to sound. And so even the album cover has a much more retro vibe. It's got a 60s record cover vibe on it. So I went back and forth between Weight of the World and Ain't No Easy Way. And I think just because I've seen him live and I've seen what this song does live, I'm going to go with Ain't No Easy Way. This song just pumps everybody up. It's just incredible.
There were certain songs going through the entire discography where I could sit there and say, yes, I could absolutely see myself and really enjoying this, hearing it live. For me, off of this album, it's the song Promise, mainly because there's the piano swing that's on that, but I could see this playing well in either a small venue or even an arena, or again, just sitting down with the headphones on. When it comes to the live experience for a band like this, and let's be honest, right? You're not getting straight radio play songs from them. You're getting a vibe through the whole thing. So for anyone who's never actually experienced them live, or in my case, up until this point, had never actually heard them, what is the BRMC live experience like? It's intense. It is fantastic. They will play usually a pretty wide variety of songs from each of their albums. The last time I saw them was actually not this past summer because they didn't tour, but the summer prior. So was it 2022? And because of the connections I have, I'm also a photographer. And so they let me come in and photograph the whole show. And it was a kind of a truncated set because they were the middle band between Zola Jesus, Black Rebel Motorcycle Club, and The Cult. And you will get ebbs and flows during when they're the headliner, because they will play the softer songs. They'll pull out the acoustics, but then they'll come back out and punch you in the face with with whatever happened to my rock and roll. If that song doesn't get played, people get mad. So it's a great. I don't want to liken it to Led Zeppelin, seeing Led Zeppelin live, because they were their own beast, but it ebbed and flowed a lot like a Led Zeppelin show, where they would come in and come out guns blazing and then do an acoustic set and then, start roaring again for the encore. I think every band has that one song that if that one song doesn't get played live, there's going to be fists flying. Oh yeah, and that's usually it's either Spread Your Love but most of the time it's a punk song. Whatever happened to my rock and roll? I think they've played that at just about every show ever. See, now I'm going to be very intrigued to go to like setlist.fm and backtrack and see if there's ever a show where they didn't play it, and then see if there's a corresponding death count with that show. Right. There might be. You got to check hospital admissions afterwards. Exactly, right? if there is a high number of incidents, quote unquote, around that time, we know what happened. Exactly. And actually, I have pulled up the set list from the last show I was at, and it's a little bit shorter than most. It's only 11 songs. So usually it's quite a bit longer, but since they were the middle band in a 3-band, not a festival, but when you get the Cult, Black Rebel Motorcycle Club, and Zola Jesus, who is also amazing, it had an awesome, almost festival vibe because there were so many different types of music. Well, having seen the Cult live, I can see how that would be a phenomenal bill.
Yeah.
We now move on to a little bit later and the Howl Sessions EP, which was a collection of unreleased tracks from the Howl Sessions. So off of this one, not a lot to choose from, but still some good stuff on there. What did you go with?
Again, see, so this is where things get difficult, because with the first album, I knew exactly what I wanted. And with the second album, didn't like as much of it, so I kind of it was easier for me to pick. But from Howl on, it gets hard for me to pick. And the Howl Sessions, even though there's, I think, 6 songs on it, I had to kind of pick between my 2 favorites, Wishing Well and Pretend. And I went against my gut at this point, and I went with Pretend, just because it has a different vibe from the energetic songs that I've picked for the other stuff. It's a little bit different, but it's still an incredible song.
It's funny because as I was listening to these songs, the 2 that were vying for my attention are diametrically opposed.
Okay.
On the one hand, you got Steal a Ride, which has got a really good toe tapping kind of feel to it. And on the other side, you've got Mercy, which feels like a very haunting campfire coffee shop kind of feel. And I ended up going with Mercy because there's something about this band. And again, this is all brand spanking new to me. So first of all, thank you for introducing me to the band and give me the opportunity to kind of go down this road.
I am so happy.
But the thing is, it's like, and I've discussed this on past episodes before, where you find yourself when you're deep diving or in discovery mode, locking into certain aspects of what the band can produce, because a lot of bands are out there that can do a lot of different things, but sometimes they do one thing really, really well. And for me, it's the haunting campfire, and I'm going to say this, glass of bourbon, because you have a sip going right about now, but that kind of sit back and have a sip kind of feel to it.
Oh, for sure. They really do have a special knack for that kind of song. And Mercy was almost, it was definitely up there. It's like I said, it was so hard to pick. I had my top 3, and then I whittled it down to 2, and I'm like, between these. But Mercy, I've seen them play that live, and it's just magical. It's just, you hit the nail on the head. It's haunting, and it's beautiful.
Moving on to April 27th, 2007, and the release of Baby 81. The album peaked at number 15 in the UK and number 46 in the US. There were 2 singles off of this one. Weapon of Choice peaked at number 35 in the UK. As I was listening to this, as I mentioned on the second album, I was getting some Joy Division vibes. Off of this one, I was getting some Biffy Clyro vibes off of the Cathedral opening of All You Do Is Talk. And I can really see how this one would go over so well, maybe as a set opener.
Oh, yeah. And I don't know that they've ever opened a set with it, to be honest. I'm not sure. It's one on that tour they played a lot, and I think the tour afterwards. But in the last couple, I don't think, I could be mistaken. I know they didn't play it the last time. Well, crap, I've got it up. Let me take a look. Maybe make sure I'm not lying to you here. Let's see. No, they didn't play it the last time I saw them. So I know I have seen them play it live, and it is really good. And that's the thing. They're a trio, and so their sound is pretty dense. And so the songs, you would think, get pared down a little bit and reconfigured, but they're pretty dense live too. They have an incredible live sound.
Oh, I mean, there's nothing saying that a power trio can't be like completely and utterly powerful. There's a reason why it's a power trio, but you think of bands like Rush, and you think of bands like Triumph. One of the loudest performers I ever saw was Biffy Clyro at the Rock on the Range Festival. I think it was 2017, perhaps. Like, they were loud to the point of I've never really felt the need to grab earplugs, but holy crap, I needed earplugs, and I wasn't even near the front of the stage. I was back by the soundboard because I'm one of those people who likes to just plant themselves right by the soundboard, because that is where you get the best sound. Put yourself as close to the person who's doing the mix as possible. Biffy Clyro was freaking loud, but they were phenomenal. I
am not familiar with this. So we're doing this, and you've never heard of Black Rebel Motorcycle. Well, you heard of it, but you've never heard them. I'm not familiar with Biffy Clyro, so I am going to have to check Biffy Clyro out after this podcast.
Oh, you have to. You absolutely have to do a deep dive on them. I think you will totally enjoy them. But,
awesome.
But off of Baby 81, what did you go with?
Well, you nailed it. I picked All You Do Is Talk. And this album has so many songs to choose from. It's such a diverse group of songs. There's so many different sounds in this album. It was tough to pick one, but I did choose All You Do Is Talk.
It's almost reassuring to me. Like, talking to someone who is a large fan of the band and me who's never gone down this road before, and the fact that we're actually matching up on them, I almost feel like I'm listening to them correctly, if that feels...
That makes total sense, though. And as a note, this is the last album with the original drummer Nick Jago. He was fired after this album. And what was really cool, and I learned this when they came on the podcast the first time, was that once they fired Nick, they still had tour dates that they had to honor. And so to bring things full circle, maybe in the middle of the podcast, they just reached out of the blue and hired as a touring drummer Pete Salisbury from The Verve.
Oh, excellent.
Yeah. So that was really cool.
We have come full circle.
But these last two albums, it's where I really start to feel, especially Baby 81 is where they start to really discover their sound. They with Howl, they really decided we're gonna forge our own path now. And Baby 81, they really started to discover what that path was and what that sound was.
There is something so almost not necessarily comforting, but definitely, ear-warming, if you will, when you find that album where the band really does find exactly what their sound is supposed to be, which is, I'm sure, why a lot of people really gravitate towards Rush's 2112, speaking of power trios.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, I agree completely. And this is that album for Black Rebel Motorcycle Club. And it's one of the albums that I go back to because I kind of, I don't want to say I stick with my favorites, but it's one of the ones that's always in my constant rotation.
Later on that year, December 4th, was the release of American X, the Baby 81 Sessions, which is a collection of B-sides and unreleased tracks. So we got another EP on the list here. So off of this, what did you go with?
I chose 20 Hours. And this was an interesting compilation because they had all the B-sides, and they did have American X, which was on the album, but they also had a video for it, which is one of the reasons they released this, is because they had done this epic, the song's 10 minutes long or so, and so they did this epic video for it, and they kind of gathered a bunch of their unreleased material and put it out as this EP. And they also had something which is it's a little weird. They had a song that's an outtake from an album that hasn't been released yet on this album. So Last Chance for Love, which was almost the pick that I chose, was an outtake from the next album that we haven't even talked about yet.
It's funny you mentioned that because Last Chance for Love is my pick off of this album. It feels like we scripted this. It feels like either you stole my notes. I think you did. But the thing is, for me, this one, the guitar tone is lyric itself in this. And there are certain songs from their discography where I can sit there and say, yes, you have vocalists, you got a lot of reverb, but that guitar tone sings just as much or as well as the lead singer.
Oh, for sure. It's really, it's a, and we'll talk about it with the upcoming album. It's a very unique song, which leads into the unique album coming up. But yeah, it's a strange mix of stuff. And I mean, I know we have the constraints of the podcast, but they have some amazing stuff that just falls through the cracks, like stuff that comes out on soundtracks, or they would do Christmas releases for the fan club. And so it would be a download only song. And you would get weird things like Last Chance for Love on stuff like that too. And so it's just, they're an odd little band, and I love them so much.
Odd is good. There's nothing wrong with that. Speaking of odd, let's throw a complete outlier into the mix here.
Yeah.
November 1st, 2008, and the release of The Effects of 333. This is a completely instrumental album and released on their own imprint, Abstract Dragon. As I was listening to this, And it's no surprise to our listeners, but I have to reiterate my full-on love of sci-fi films. As I was listening to this movie, it felt like it would have worked as the soundtrack to George Lucas's THX 1138.
Ooh, I didn't think about that, but wow. I may have to sync those up and give that a shot.
Is this going to be like Dark Side of the Moon and the Wizard of Oz, where you just sync it up to the third roar of the lion and you're good to go?
But you got to make sure you add Last Chance for Love in there somewhere.
Exactly. But that's the thing. The first couple of songs on this, it really feels like a sci-fi soundscape for a very avant-garde kind of film. Yeah. So when you get to this, you as a fan, when you get to this album, is this intriguing or a weird left turn at Albuquerque?
Yeah. It is.
It can be both.
It's so bizarre. I remember because it was only released as like you mentioned, as a download. And I remember not knowing anything about it. They just said, oh yeah, we've got this album coming out. It's, we're self-releasing it. And I know why, because it's basically what it is. It's just stuff that they worked on tour. They were what they were recording on the road. It's ideas that they were working on that just wasn't, they weren't going to fit anywhere. They had lost their drummer. They were working with a temporary drummer at the time. And so it was just little workouts to experiment. And they knew, I believe, they knew it wasn't going to ever be anything that ended up on an album. But then they kind of started finding these bits and pieces. I'm like, this is interesting. Why don't we just put this out for fans as a download? And it, with no lyrical content for the most part. I think the last song has vocals, but they're not really words. You can't understand them. You don't know what's going on. But even with that, it's a very eerie album. It's just everything's very modulated on the vocals, cut and paste, and everything's pretty much unintelligible, but it's just a strange album. And I remember kind of feeling, I don't want to say disappointed with it, but I remember kind of like when a dog doesn't really understand what's going on, you just kind of cock your head. It's kind of what I did.
So off of this album, what did you go with?
I picked, and that's the other thing, the song titles are a little odd. So I picked And With This Comes. So it's kind of odd.
Funny enough, I actually went with And With This Comes as well. And again, for me, it's very much the ambient guitar vibe off this. But I had to point out, A Twisted State is such an outlier on this album.
Yeah,
you have this,
on an outlier album. That's just
Is that make it an inlier? I guess I'm not quite sure.
It's a double outie.
But I will say that anyone who liked Pink Floyd's The Endless River, which of course was the instrumental album that came out not that long ago, and it felt more kind of like instrumental outtakes from when they were doing The Division Bell. This album, if you like that album, you will probably like this one as well.
Yeah, and A Twisted State was one that I was considering, or Needed was another one. So if you let it go and don't pay attention to it, it's interesting background music, and it does tend to melt together, so you don't really notice it. And there's not one thing that's going to hit you and shake you out of whatever you're doing. Like, oh, that's my favorite song, let me turn it up. It's just a weird ambient album.
Yeah, it's not road trip material, but you'll be going 20 kilometers an hour down the road.
Oh yeah. Well, staring. Oh, and you'll have that 1,000-yard stare.
Yeah, exactly. At that point, just pull off to the side of the road and wait for the album to finish, and then you're going to be good.
Exactly.
March 5th, 2010 saw the release of Beat the Devil's Tattoo. At this point, we now have Lee Shapiro on drums, replacing Nick Jago. The album peaked at number 58 in the UK and at the same position in the US. There was one single off of this one, the title track, Beat the Devil's Tattoo. Off of this one, what's your pick?
My pick on this one is Beat the Devil's Tattoo, with Half State, the epic 10-minute song at the end, being really close to being picked. But I just... Beat the Devil's Tattoo is basically the song that they start a lot of shows with now. And it's among BRMC fans, it's a classic song. And so it's got this really great pounding rhythm. And it's a heavy song with a lot of acoustics. Much like Led Zeppelin's first album, it's a heavy album, but most of the guitars on that were acoustic. And that's kind of what this reminds me of.
I found, in comparison to a lot of their earlier albums, this album had a lot of groove to it. Yeah,
it did. And it has, being Leah's first album with the band, they're feeling each other out a little bit. They'd known each other for a while, but Leah was touring with a few different bands that had toured with BRMC, like the Ravenettes and all. And so they knew each other, but working together is a whole different thing. And, you still have to feel each other out. And so I think this was a really cool album to get the new feel of the band. And it sounds like Bad Blood. You almost get a My Bloody Valentine feel when the guitars kick in or in the chorus. It's a really good, solid album for a new drummer.
Oh, yeah. I mean, and that's the thing. This album really, the songs that had the grooves were the ones that kind of made my short list. Mama Taught Me Better was definitely on the almost made it list, but for me, it's Conscience Killer off this one.
Oh,
yeah.
Good.
It also, and again, I feel like I'm making a lot of comparisons here, but that's kind of what you do when you're experiencing something for the first time. You make comparisons to known quantities and known entities. So for me, Conscience Killer had almost a Black Keys vibe to it.
Yeah. I can absolutely see that. And that's what they get, that buzzsaw guitar going in, especially at the end. And then Leah's just pounding the crap out of those drums. I absolutely, that's a great track. I'm glad you picked that one. That actually didn't make my short list, but it is one of my favorites on the album. But it's one I forget about. It's interesting because I think it's the second track on the album, but it's between some amazing stuff like Bad Blood, which the My Bloody Valentine feel to that, the guitar is just, I love My Bloody Valentine. So, and Aya was another one that live will blow your ears out. So if you go see them and they start playing Aya live, put your earplugs in.
Good to know. Good to know. If Biffy Clyro hasn't ruined my ears at this point after that show at Rock on the Range, I'm ready to destroy them. Okay.
Excellent.
We now move on to March 18th, 2013, and the release of Spectre at the Feast. The album peaked at number 31 in the UK and number 35 in the US. There was one single off of this one, Let the Day Begin. This album, there's a lot of backstory to this. Of course, this is the first album that wasn't produced by Michael Bean, who was the producer and father of Robert LaVon Bean after he passed away. How tough had this album been to make? This, for the band, it was really... it's called Spectre at the Feast, and there are a lot of specters in this album because, like you said, Robert's father passed away. He wrote the song Returning for him, which Returning made my short list. Spoiler, it's not my choice, but it's one of the most beautiful songs on the album. And shortly after the recording, Leah was diagnosed with Chiari malformations. Chiari malfunctions? I got to remember which it was, but which required brain surgery. So she had to go in for brain surgery and then had to relearn how to play drums. And it took over a year for her to recover, to get the surgery. And they had to, help raise funds because they're independent artists. They don't have all, and they're not like, Rolling Stones where, Mick Jagger has a heart condition. They can fly him over here to the U.S. to get, worked on. They're independent artists. They needed some help. So they did a GoFundMe, and she was able to get the surgery and
had to rehab and relearn how to play drums. So they were actually not touring this album for quite a while. So this album is a heavy album for the band.
Yeah, it feels like there's a lot of both purging and catharsis at the same time while with the writing of this one. But off of this album, what song did you go with?
I went with Sell It, because that song kind of encapsulates all the different songs on the album, the different sounds on this album. And this might be my favorite BRMC album. It's just got so many different tracks to it. I like Beat the Devil's Tattoo was great. And actually, Beat the Devil's Tattoo, I did forget to mention, was themed on Edgar Allan Poe. So this one, no theme that I can remember, but it is my favorite. And I don't know where the hell I was going with that whole theme thing, but it's got now I remember. There was a little bit of constraint because of the theme. I feel like they even did an Edgar Allan Poe cover on the album. They did Annabelle Lee on Beat the Devil's Tattoo. And they kind of freed themselves up a little bit more. I think Leah had been there. They were touring. They were more comfortable together. And I think they kind of felt a little more free to expand the sound, to experiment a bit more. And that's one of the reasons I think it's my favorite BRMC album.
My pick off of this album is Lullaby. And there's a few bands that it really reminded me of. The first one you're going to know. It's Radiohead.
Yeah.
But the second one, there was a Canadian band called Pilot, and they eventually changed their name to Pilot Speed. And I remember seeing Pilot before they got signed to a label and before the name change. And I actually still have that EP that they had that they were touring on at the time. And just being able to experience this very good Radiohead vibe. Like we're talking like pre-OK Computer, like the Benz era Radiohead.
Oh, yeah.
The good stuff, right?
Yeah.
Lullaby reminded me so much of that first experience seeing Pilot live. And, the band is no longer together anymore. And you actually cannot find that EP anywhere out there. Not on YouTube, not on Spotify. And I still got it here, and it's all good. But yeah, wow. It was just a moment. So I put that story out there to say this. When you go see a band live, dear listeners, go to the merch booth and buy their CDs, because you never know when one of these bands is either A, going to make it big and you never get a chance to see it, or B, when you have these artists that are really living off of what they do at the shows, right? The concert tickets that get sold and the merch that they sell. Support the bands. Go see them before you can't see them, because you would not believe how much that goes to helping those bands out. So by all means, merch up when you're there. Trust me.
Oh yeah, go with a nice budget, because another thing to consider, and something that I've discovered in my 30 years of going to see bands now, if it's not an enormous band, if it's not like Bush or the Rolling Stones or Radiohead, you might find some tour exclusives. It's like I've gotten a bunch, like you mentioned, the EP for Pilot. I've gotten a few EPs and tour only things at shows. One of the most recent ones I went to was Griff Rhys opening up for the band This Is the Kit, and they had a limited edition EP. There's 2 songs, each band doing a cover of the other band, and they had 200 copies, and they almost sold them out the first show. I was at the first show, and I bought copy 193. So you can find some really cool stuff, and that's not going to be out anywhere else. So you can find some really wild exclusive stuff.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I remember going to see the Interrupters when they were here in Toronto, and they were talking about one of the first shows they ever played in this area was at this small little club in Oshawa. Pop Evil once called it the Dirty Schwa, and there's a reason. But but it's one of those things where, if you get the chance to go see these bands at these smaller shows, or, whenever they do make it to your town, just enjoy the moment. Go and merch up, rock out, and have a good time.
Yeah, you're supporting the artist. If you like them, you're helping them to come back because they know where they sell merch and the door. You know, they'll take note of that stuff.
We now move on to the last album of our journey, Wrong Creatures, released January 12th, 2018. The album hit number 35 in the UK and hit number 8 in Switzerland. There were 4 singles off of this one. Unfortunately, none of them charted. So off of this last album, what did you go with?
There was no doubt in my mind on this one. There's some that were close, but I had to go with Echo. That song is to me, it's maybe the best Black Rebel Motorcycle Club song recorded. It's just amazing. It's got almost like a Lou Reed Walk on the Wild Side bass sound, but when Robert and Peter write a song together, it's just magical. And this song is just it. It's amazing.
See, I feel bad now because you say that was the best song ever recorded, and it's not my pick.
Well, I had others that came close, like Ninth Configuration and Carried from the Start were really close, but there's just something about that song that it just hits me really deeply.
See, for me, this album started and ended with Haunt. And
that was on my short list.
And again, you get those Radiohead vibes, but it also had a very, for lack of a better term, Chris Isaak Wicked Game kind of vibe to it. And again, just one of those things where Black Rebel Motorcycle Club, when they get into that haunting type mode, it's really that for me, that's the ear candy from this band.
Yeah. And one of my favorite things with this album is it's the return of Leah. You know, she's back and she's able to record. She's back full strength. You know, this is when I actually reached out to see if they would be willing to come on the podcast. And to my surprise, she answered because I wanted to know what happened, you know, about the condition and how she was doing because the album had just come out, and reached out on, it was Twitter at the time, not expecting any reply. And I didn't hear anything for 2 or 3 months. And to my surprise, one day I get a direct message in my Twitter feed, and it's from Leah. And she's like, I'd love to do the podcast. Let me know when. And since then, we just, you know, we've stayed in touch, and she got me the ability to come and be an official photographer for them for their show. I live close to DC, but I had to miss that show. So my wife and I drove up to Pittsburgh the day before and went to go see that show. So
love Pittsburgh. Absolutely love Pittsburgh. I've visited there at least once, and it is a wonderful city. All right.
Yeah,
so
one time for me too, and I loved it.
So now I'm going to give you the really hard job here. So before we figure out which one stands up above all, please go through your list again and remind our listeners which songs you picked off of which album. And then, if there can only be one, which song is it going to be?
Okay. So off the BRMC debut, I chose Awake. From Take Them On Your Own, I chose In Like the Rose. From Howl, I chose Ain't No Easy Way. The Howl Sessions, I chose Pretend. From Baby 81, All You Do Is Talk. American X, the Baby 81 Sessions, I chose 20 Hours. The Effects of 333, and With This Comes. Beat the Devil's Tattoo, I chose the album track, Beat the Devil's Tattoo. Spectre at the Feast, I chose Sell It. And Wrong Creatures, I chose Echo.
And if there can only be one, what song is it going to be?
This was so tough. Last Chance for Love. No, and With This Comes. Just kidding. It was between Echo and 20 Hours. And I said Echo is probably the best Black Rebel Motorcycle Club song on record. And I did not choose it. I went with 20 Hours.
And why that one over top of Echoes?
There's the guitar. It's a little more rock than Echo. Echo is a little more groove. It's a little on their softer side. And 20 Hours is, while not anything like Teenage Disease or Conscience Killer. There's a harder guitar. It kind of harkens back a little bit to their psychedelic period, which I like a lot. But when they hit that bridge and they have these echoey guitar lines, I can't beat that. It's just, that's it for me.
And a reminder to our listeners that you can go to our website at notthatbadcast.com to the There Can Only Be One page and see both the playlists from Mark and I and have a listen to the songs that are there. And for songs that aren't available on Spotify, I'm going to put the YouTube links for those songs where I can, just so you can actually hear them all. Okay, for my list, off of BRMC, I went with Rifles. From Take Them On Your Own, I went with In Like the Rose. I picked Promise off of Howl and Mercy off of the Howl Sessions EP. Off of Baby 81, I went with All You Do Is Talk. And off of the American X Baby 81 Sessions EP, I went with Last Chance for Love. From the effects of 333, I went with End With This Comes. I picked Conscience Killer off Beat the Devil's Tattoo. Lullaby off of Spectre at the Feast. And off of Wrong Creatures, I went with Haunt. But if there can only be one, and this one's tough.
Yeah.
Because I'm flip-flopping between two here.
Okay.
And it may change tomorrow. It may change the next day back. But I think I'm going to go with Promise off of this one from Howl.
Oh, nice.
But it's between that and Lullaby. And I think Promise kind of wins out. And more because even though it's not one of those haunting vibe kind of feels to it, I still love the fact that I could picture myself listening to this in almost any environment, whether it be live or sitting in that chair with the headphones on, glass of something in the hand, and just relaxing.
Oh, for sure. And they actually played that live on that tour with the trombone occasionally.
Oh, that would be good.
Pete broke out the trombone. In fact, there's video of it. They did release a live album. They've released, I think, 3 live albums. And on their very first one, it's just called Live. It comes with a DVD, and it's got some outtakes and all, and you can see Pete playing the trombone on it. And so I'm not exactly sure if they played it in front of an audience with the trombone, but I know he pulled out a trombone, and they do have it recorded somewhere.
That I'm going to have to check that out for sure. Mark, thank you so much for this. Now, before we go, please let our listeners know about the Performance Anxiety Podcast and where they can find you out there on the internets.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for having me on. This has been a blast. And I love going back and listening to some of the albums that I maybe haven't listened to in a little while. So I host the Performance Anxiety Podcast on Pantheon Podcasts. It's a show that tries to get behind the scenes stories from artists, mainly musicians. We release an episode every week, but we do also branch out. We've had chefs on, we've had photographers, authors, poets. So we do try to hit all creative areas. And you can find me on all the socials at Performance ANX, and I'm on Spotify, Google Podcasts, I guess, Apple, all at Performance Anxiety. Or you can look us up on, I think, Pantheon's homepage.
Mark, there is a seat waiting for you whenever you want to come back, and we will have to set up that Verve episode somewhere down the road.
I would love it. You just name the time and place.
Perfect. And to you, our listeners, thank you for listening to this episode of There Can Only Be One. Now, you guys know the drill. If there is an artist that you want us to cover, be sure to hit us up on social media at OnlyOneCast or go to our website at notthatbadcast.com. And while you're there, make sure you check out all of our other shows, including our brand new one on the There Can Only Be One channel, Spin, Shuffle, Skip. Until next time, he's Mark, I'm Jay. This is There Can Only Be One, a proud member of the Pantheon Podcast Network. Take care.
To celebrate joining Pantheon Podcasts, Rock Camp, the podcast, the official podcast of Rock and Roll Fantasy Camp, is giving away a guitar signed by Mike Portnoy of Dream Theater, Marty Friedman, formerly of Megadeth, and legendary shredder Zakk Wylde, plus our rockstar counselors like Vinny Appice, Monty Pittman, and more. To enter to win, simply follow, rate, and review our podcast on your preferred platform, and that's all you have to do. For more information, go to rockcamp.com/podcast.